thought I'd do a video on consciousness and relationships, or the consciousness of relationships. More specifically, understanding an individual's relationship karma, how to help somebody with their relationships through using astrology. And if we're going to take a look at the consciousness of relationships and karma in relationships, it's really helpful to do so through the nakshatras, because the nakshatras are connected to the moon. They're considered the wives of the moon. And the moon in astrology is known as manas, or the sensory mind. And it's with our senses, or the sensory mind, that we navigate our experience of consciousness. So the moon really is connected very deeply with consciousness. The moon reflects the light of the sun. The sun is known as the Atman. It's the soul. So the moon is the consciousness that is reflecting the light of the soul. And that moon is striving to be as brilliant as the sun, or brilliant as the soul. The nakshatras are considered to be the wives of the moon. And it's the wives of the moon that carry the power, or the energy of the moon itself. So the nakshatras are the powers with which we're able to grow our consciousness. And when a planet is in a nakshatra, or a house cusp is in a nakshatra, then that nakshatra is going to set the tone of how that individual is going to grow the consciousness of that particular factor of their life. So we're going to take a look at a chart that's known as Person C. I just basically created this chart. I just picked a date out of the blue in order to look at a chart so that it wouldn't be one individual specific chart. And we did this particular chart in the video on Rahu and Ketu through the nakshatras. And if you want to watch that video, there should be a link in the bottom left-hand corner of this video, which can take you to that, so you can understand a little bit of the background of this chart. But just to point out briefly a summary of it, the individual has Ketu conjuncting the 7th cusp and Rahu conjuncting the 1st cusp. The moon is something in their chart that's called the Dharakaraka, which is an indicator through the Jaimini system of astrology of the person's spouse. So it's interesting that Ketu is conjunct the 7th cusp in this chart, which is the relationship house, and Ketu is with the moon. Could go very deeply into that factor alone, but we want to look at some of the other factors. So I would point you to that video to go more into depth with some of the things that I've spoken about in association with that. But just suffice it to say that Ketu conjuncting the 7th cusp can make it so that the individual is going to feel more comfortable being in a relationship than they are not being in a relationship. And through some of the factors that were flushed out with this particular individual's chart, they found, or tend to find, great inspiration in their spouse. And possibly in a previous lifetime, they found themselves in a relationship with somebody who was very inspiring to them. But likely some things happened over the course of that relationship where things were revealed to them, or the truth was hidden from them. But rather than not being in a relationship, they decided to just try to have faith in their partner and to continue on with it. With Rahu, down here in the first, Rahu is going to show what the individual is being pulled more towards, and that's the 1st house cusp. So they're needing to focus on developing themselves outside of relationships, who they are, how to work more in harmony with themselves. And because Rahu is in Virgo, it means that they're going to be doing that through service in their lifetime, through working more in harmony with themselves rather than giving themselves completely over to another, which was likely the karma, pardon me, that was associated with previous lifetimes. But I thought, for the sake of this video, that we would take a look at the Dharakaraka. I thought we would also take a look at the Lord of the 7th cusp, which is Jupiter, which is also the natural indicator for relationships if we're looking at a female chart. So we'll just make this chart a female chart, even though it's just a randomly created chart that I picked a date out of the blue with. In addition, we'll look at the 7th house cusp. That's going to show the person's relationships in general. And we'll look at the 9th cusp because we're going to explore the Navamsha chart. The 9th cusp and the Navamsha chart are looked at in terms of long-term relationships or in terms of marriage, whereas the Saptamsha would be looked at in terms of relationships in general, the person's capacity to be within a relationship with somebody and have that relationship mean something more than being by themselves. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at the Dara Karaka, which in this particular instance is in Purva Bhadrapada. As I was saying in the last video, Purva Bhadrapada is going to elevate anything that comes into contact with it, right? It gives the power of elevation. So it's likely that this person seeks an inspiring partner, somebody who makes them feel better about themselves, somebody who nurtures them, because we're looking at the moon in this particular instance. But if we follow this thread a little more deeply and we look at something that's called Tarabala, Tarabala will show us the way that the person or the path of consciousness that the individual is going to approach spouse with, sorry, a little tongue twisted there. So I'm going to bring up another screen so we can take a look at that. And basically the moon, we look at something called the Janma Nakshatra. And as the moon is in Purva Bhadrapada, we want to see where the ruler of Purva Bhadrapada is, which is Jupiter. And Jupiter is there with the moon. And because they're in Janma Nakshatra, that means initiation, sparking things. So it's quite likely that, that this individual, in terms of having a spouse, they like having a spouse that's going to spark things for them. Right. In addition to that, because we're talking about the moon in general, when the person feels like they're in a state of need, they're going to wish or desire to naturally spark a relationship because they're more comfortable being in a relationship because they have that association with Ketu on the 7th cusp, right? And that basically creates, as I may have discussed earlier, I forgot if I said this, a tendency to fall back on relationships in times of difficulty. So we want to take a look in terms of the Rashi chart at how Jupiter's doing here. And so we've got a nice, strong Jupiter in the Rashi chart, with the exception of, at some points, the fact that Jupiter sharing Cancer with the Sun sometimes gets a little bit starved by the Sun, right? So other than that, though, the individual has a very strong Jupiter. So that means, in general, they're going to be able to attract partners that are very inspiring to them, that are somewhat uplifting to them. So all those things are positive, but that isn't the full picture. So we're going to take a look at the full picture a little more deeply once we explore the Navamsha chart. Let's follow this thread a little bit further, and let's look at where the 7th cusp is. To do that, we need to bring up another little subscreen here. We're going to make a note that the 7th cusp is in Shatabisha, whereas the 9th cusp is in Bharani, because both of those are going to be important. So 7th cusp is in Shatabisha, and the 9th is in Bharani. Okay. So when we're looking at the 7th cusp, we're looking at this through the Rashi first. Why? Because the Rashi is going to signify the individual's path in general in their life. So on the individual's path in life, we can see that they've got a good strong moon. So that means they can have a decent spouse in many cases, although not a perfect spouse, and they can have a very uplifting spouse because Jupiter rules Purva Bhadrapada, rather. Okay, let's take a look overall at Shatabisha, which is associated with Rahu. Okay, so we need to see how this individual is going to approach relationships in general. So to do that, we need to go back to our Tara chart. And we can see that Rahu is in the position that's called Sadak in the moon. Okay, which means the individual is going to accept their path in terms of relationships and try to really perfect relationships in this particular lifetime. So that's how they approach relationships, as a way of completing themselves when times are hard, because we see that K2 moon conjunction. But also, additionally, there is a motive within them that wants to perfect their relationship karma, and that can be good. And Rahu is going to draw them into that, as we were seeing that Rahu first house conjunction. Let's explore the ninth cusp too while we're here and we're looking at that. That's in Bharani. So to look at Bharani, we need to look at the moon, right? Ninth cusp is going to show more the side of relationships where the individual is trying to find purpose within relationships. And we're going to explore what each of those individual nakshatras mean here in a moment. So basically with Venus in the fifth position, that's called Prachak. So that means that the individual, in terms of long-term relationships, is going to continually try to find a level of satisfaction or a level of constancy, but they're going to end up coming up frustrated. They're not going to find quite as much of the security that they're seeking through relationships. And we can take a look more deeply at how that plays out for them, both on their life path and both within relationships in general. So let's explore each of those. Let's go back. So as we take a look, we need to see the strength of Venus in addition to the strength of Rahu. To judge the strength of Rahu in the Rashi chart, we need to look at Rahu's rule, which is Mercury. Okay, so we're looking at relationships in general. Okay, so Mercury in the Rashi chart is at the end of Leo. And because it's at the end of Leo, that makes Mercury in a special condition that's called Mrita, right? So Mercury is devoid of strength because of that. And so in terms of Shatabisha, which is where the seventh cusp is, which is ruled by Rahu, but Rahu's behaving like Mercury, not to make it too confusing for you, because Shatabisha generally tends to create situations where things appear to be one way. And we're pulled in a certain direction, just like Rahu pulls us. Rahu will pull us in a certain direction, thinking that we're going somewhere, but actually we're going somewhere different. A lot of whether we enjoy that experience or have a hard time with that experience is going to be connected with Rahu's dignity. So generally, this individual likely has some difficulties or hardship associated with that. They think that something is going one way in their relationships, and it actually ends up being quite different. And as we can see, Ketu in Uttara Bhadrapada here, which Uttara Bhadrapada has a tendency to reveal things to the individual, which were not immediately apparent, and it makes them kind of see the light, even if they don't want to see the light, so it can reveal truths to the individual, which make them look at things in a different way. So with Rahu ruling Shatabisha, which is where that seventh cusp is, it's quite likely that this individual thinks that their partner is a certain way, but there's actually more going on to the story than is immediately apparent. In terms of their life path, because Mercury, which is the lord of Rahu, even though Mercury has no strength, Mercury is going to approach that with the energy of being in a great friend sign. So the individual is still going to be delighted, because that's what a planet being in a great friend sign creates. It creates delight, feelings of delight. The person feels delighted about being in relationships. That makes them feel more comfortable. So even if things get revealed, as we were saying before, the individual is likely going to find more happiness being in a relationship than outside of a relationship, even if they have to suffer through that particular difficulty. Okay? Looking at that ninth cusp, what is Bharani about? Well, Bharani tends to take us from one phase of our life to another. Bharani generally also relates to, in order for a new creation to come into being, something old has to be relinquished. In addition to that, another connection with Bharani is that for something to be created, there are sometimes difficulties or labor pains, all associations of Bharani. In the Rashi chart, Venus, the ruler of Bharani, also Venus is debilitated. And so that's, very low feeling. So that creates a lot of hardship in terms of long-term relationships for the individual. They don't tend to have the best luck with long-term relationships because Venus is debilitated. Venus actually is also shamed in the Rashi chart. But because basically when a planet shares a sign with one of the nodes, and also another cruel planet, then that creates a condition of shame, right? So the person is usually on some level ashamed of their relationship. So in other words, if someone were to find out that this person had been through a lot of relationship hardship, this person wouldn't feel very happy about it, or they'd want to cover up things that their spouse had done. All very probable occurrences in terms of this particular chart. So the individual has hardship with relationships because there's that ninth cusp there. That's going to create some difficulties. For that individual to be in a relationship, they're going to go through some hardships, which likely make them feel like they're not, really being their own best friend. But still, in most instances, they would much rather be in a relationship than not be in a relationship. Okay? Just a brief note on this. Because of Rahu being in Virgo and Mercury being in the 12th, that means as the individual is trying to be more happy within themselves in this lifetime and to find more comfort in cooperating with themselves and being their own best friend, they're going to encounter a lot of loss. And because they're encountering that loss, that's going to make them want to fall back on that being in a relationship for comfort. But really, it's probably not the best thing for them. They need to be approaching relationships because it's a worthwhile relationship, not because they are feeling uncomfortable inside of themselves, which is a natural tendency, but more heightened in this person's particular chart. Also, in addition to that, because of the ninth being in Bharani, this person likely has a very hard time letting go in a relationship, and that's going to come to the surface for them. Okay? So we need to also explore the Navamsha chart. Let's take a look at the Navamsha, and let's take a look at where that ninth cusp is, and let's take a look in addition, while we're here, at where that seventh cusp is. Ninth cusp is in Aquarius. So we can see that that's ruled over by Saturn. So how is Saturn doing in this person's Navamsha chart? We're looking at long-term relationships for them in general. Saturn is actually in this, in the Navamsha, is at the very end of Sagittarius. And because it's at the very end of Sagittarius, Saturn is also devoid of strength. So the person will have a very difficult time subjectively being in long-term relationships. They just generally don't tend to work for the individual. Why? Because they're on this path of consciousness where they're needing to focus more on making their primary relationship be with themselves, even though they're having a hard time doing it. Their relationship karma is going to pull them back into doing that very thing. Even if they have a hard time with it, it's going to make them focus on it. Okay? And because that ninth cusp is in Bharani, when that happens, the individual is likely going to have a very hard time letting go. Quite likely, the person is going to have a lot of long-term relationships once they get into them. Because Saturn also is the Lord of the 12th Rashi here. So that's going to create a lot of endings and terminations to relationships at a particular time in the individual's life. So not a very good karma in association with relationships. Looking at the seventh cusp, we're going to explore the seventh cusp in the Saptamsha, as well as the Navamsha. Okay, so in the Navamsha, that means the person's capacity to maintain a long-term creative relationship with their partner, meaning they can continue to have fun, do meaningful things with their partner, all being shown through the seventh cusp, which we remember is in Shatabisha. So we need to take a look at Rahu's dignity here too. And Rahu's dignity here is also associated with Mercury, because Mercury governs Virgo, which is where Rahu is placed. So in terms of Shatabisha, even though this individual likely has things revealed to them, as we were looking at through the Rashi chart, that are not what they thought the relationship was about, they still find meaning in that. They still find meaning in being with the person that they're with because of that past karma with relationships, because they find inspiration in relationships. They find comfort in relationships through having faith in the other, all things that are there. And even though, because Shatabisha tends to have this particular energy tone associated with it too, which it creates the tendency for the individual to resign themselves to the particular state of existence that they're in. So even though their relationships are not happy, they will likely continually resign themselves to sticking with that partnership, just because they would much rather be in the relationship than be out of it. Okay, so that's the way that plays itself out. Looking at the Saptamsha chart, which is going to show the person's relationships in general, we also want to look at that seventh cusp. Let's move on. I don't know if this is covering it up or not, because I don't know if that shows, but moving that out of the way so we can look at the seventh, which is in Libra. So we need to look at Venus here. How does Venus support that seventh cusp, right? The person tends to have very good creative partnerships with an individual, which means they get into a partnership. It makes them feel more confident because Venus is in its own house. And Venus supports that seventh cusp, so they feel confident in partnerships, in having fun with their partner, creating something different than they would be able to create by themselves. Okay, just some of the associations of the seventh cusp in the Saptamsha and how we examine that. So, some very strong, positive relationship energy there. Looking at Venus also as being in Shatabisha, which is where, which is ruled by Rahu. Looking at Rahu here, Rahu also in Virgo, and you've got a good, strong Mercury there. So again, the karma of things potentially being revealed to them, having a lot of hardship with relationship, but actually that hardship usually bonds them closer together with their partner. But the thing is long-term relationships for this individual are not going to be something that is a strong possibility for the individual, mainly because of that ninth cusp. The person's got the capacity to put energy into relationships. They want to put energy into relationships. They feel better being in a relationship than outside of that relationship. But by the same token, long-term relationships for them are usually approached from a space of just feeling well, like they take more comfort from a relationship. I'm trying to think of the right words. In addition, they likely approach it from a space of scarcity within themselves, that if they don't have somebody they can relate to, they're going to feel uncomfortable with themselves, which is a very strong potential, because we have to keep coming back to this Rashi chart and taking a look at Ketu conjuncting the seventh and Rahu conjuncting the first. That's going to pull that individual along a certain path to focus more on relating to themselves. But because Rahu's in Virgo, usually with Rahu in Virgo, it tends to create energy where an individual has to do something regardless of whether they want to do it or not. So we see that shame or difficulty, if somebody knew the real story with this person's relationships, right? And Basically, we would also need to take a look at the fact that Rahu is conjuncting Mars. And with Rahu conjuncting Mars, there can be a lot of power struggles for the individual. So as they try to define themselves, there's a lot of power struggles. And they usually attract a lot of enemies. In the past, they likely fell back on their partner to help them with those particular instances. And it was quite likely their partner was also pretty aggressive and could have even been aggressive with them due to this Ketu moon conjunction and the interaction between Rahu, Mars, and Ketu. But that creating shame for the individual. The individual doesn't want somebody to know about their relationship karma or why they have a hard time. But really, this person, their focus on relationships needs to be along the lines of perfecting themselves. We were looking at Rahu in being in Sadak Tara. That sixth Tara position means the person has to finish up a lot of karma in this particular lifetime around relationships. Sure, they're going to experience loss as they do that, but really defining themselves, learning to work more in harmony with themselves, because Rahu is going to Tara Pavani. That's about knowing what you need to do and actually really approaching that energy of doing what you need to do with a lot of strength and trying to find confidence within self, because we're dealing with the first house here. And they've got a good, strong sun in order to help them with that. And why the sun? Well, the sun is the ruler of Uttara Phalguni. But they're going to do it likely because they feel empty, because the sun's in neutral dignity here. So they feel empty. So they're going to be put in positions where they either have to fall back on relationships, which are going to leave them continually feeling empty, or they have to focus on themselves because they're feeling empty. And that's actually going to take them somewhere productive. We can even explore this a little more deeply while we're here and take a look at the Tara that is connected with Uttara Phalguni. From two different angles, we're going to do this. So looking at the sun from the moon, pardon me, the individual is very open-minded because the sun is in Sampat position. So they're open-minded and receptive to trying to work more in harmony with themselves. But we also need to look at that position from Rahu, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So again, that's Sadak position. So the person is really going to try to put energy into themselves in this particular lifetime, even though they feel more comfortable in a relationship than outside of a relationship. They will eventually recognize that the universe is trying to put a little bird whistling a tune in their ear, much to the note of you need to focus on yourself rather than focusing quite so deeply on relationships. So, you can go so much deeper even than what we have done with the Nakshatras here. You can explore this pretty much ad infinitum in terms of the chart and really understand what's going on for an individual in terms of relationship karma. Let's take a look more deeply too while we're here. So basically, if we want to understand, because that ninth cusp is not very strong in the person's Navamsha chart, and that's associated with Saturn. The person doesn't have their needs fulfilled because basically Saturn is experiencing some form of, I would imagine it's starvation from the moon, but I won't know until I look. So while I've got you here, we'll take a look at that too. Yes, Saturn has a very strong aspect from the moon, so it's starvation from the moon. And because of that, Saturn makes the individual feel low, and it becomes very difficult for them to maintain their partnerships. Ketu moon conjunctions are very difficult. I'm going to talk about that here in a moment before we end the video. But what can actually help that ninth cusp? That's Mercury. Where does Mercury rule in the Navamsha chart? Well, we can see that Mercury is the 5th lord, and it's also the 8th lord. So, trying to go through the transitions in relationships and on one level put their feelings to one side are going to make the relationships last, may not make them feel happy. Mercury's in Magha Nakshatra. That's the way I'm coming up with this. Ketu is in Pisces, which is ruled by Jupiter. Ketu rules Magha. So we need to look at Jupiter to understand Ketu's dignity. And so that's going to make it so the individual will likely put their pain to one side so they can continue enjoying their partnership. But that may not be ultimately the best thing for them, right? It's not something that's going to create a lot of happiness for them. But it can make their relationships last if that's primarily what we're looking at. So during Mercury times, Mercury can help to make their relationship last by talking to their partner, even though they've had difficulty, and taking the unorthodox approach of rather than leaving the partnership, which is what most people would do, instead they'll likely stay with it if they're going to be in a long-term relationship. But it's not going to be lasting, because once those periods are over, when Mercury can help the individual, it's likely the relationships are still going to fall apart for them. But if they want to take more happiness from their relationships, well, sure, they could try to just put their pain to one side, right? But that's actually not the best thing for their individual karma. Why? When you have a Ketu moon conjunction, it tends to create a tendency for the individual to not have a healthy emotional life. They put their emotions in a particular place rather than experiencing the emotions healthily. And so they repress their emotions until finally those emotions tend to rise to the surface in a very big way. And the individual goes into very deep places with their emotions that make it very difficult for people to be around them, because nobody can help them out of those situations. So really the best thing for this person would be to try to have a healthy relationship with themselves, really honor their feelings, so that then they can get into healthier relationships where they can have space when they need it, relationships where they feel that they can have real faith in their partner, right? And if that relationship doesn't end up working, just being willing to walk the other way. Right? That's not an easy thing for the person, but it does show that it is this person's particular path of consciousness in this lifetime in regards to relationships. So thanks for watching. If you're interested in having an analysis of your relationship karma, please feel free to click the button in the bottom left-hand corner of this video, and you can go to my Astrological Services page where you can schedule an astrological service with me. Thank you.